Everyone knows Brian Wilson, the boy genius of Southern California, who turned sunlit surf songs into cathedral-like harmonies. The fragile composer who bent sound itself to his will, only to be undone by the very demons he tried to drown out with music. His voice and vision carried an entire generation, yet the cost was staggering. His sanity, his friendships, his family. Fans remember the brilliance, the world remembers the breakdowns. But few realize what all of this meant for his children. 7 of them. 7 lives born not into ordinary households, but into a storm of headlines, whispered scandals, and lingering shadows. Some were born in the glow of fame's early light, when cameras still loved the Wilson name. Others came later, in the quieter aftermath, when their father was more ghost than guardian, more myth than man. A few bore his blood, a few were adopted into his name, and all of them lived in the long echo of Brian's unraveling mind. Imagine your earliest memories punctuated not by bedtime stories, but by reporters parked on your street. Imagine walking into a classroom, every classmate humming your father's songs, while you sat there wishing you were anyone else. Imagine growing up with a parent the entire world claimed to know, while you barely recognized him at the dinner table. The Wilson home was never a typical home. There were Beverly Hills houses filled with gold records and silence, recording studios that felt like second living rooms, and nights when Brian himself drifted like a phantom through the hallways, lost in his own mind. There were sudden disappearances, both physical and emotional, days when their father vanished behind locked bedroom doors, and months when he vanished altogether. When Brian was present, his children sometimes glimpsed warmth, even laughter. When he wasn't, the absence was crushing. They were born into privilege, yes, mansions, limousines, money enough to shield them from the everyday struggles of other families. But privilege didn't mean peace. Their inheritance was something no child ever asked for, a fractured legacy, one that carried as much pain as it did glory. Carnie and Wendy, the first daughters, found themselves pulled into music before they could even choose. Their voices echoed their father's, and the world wanted them to be perfect before they were even grown. Delanie Rose, Dakota Rose, and Daria Rose, each daughter caught in a quieter struggle, balancing love for a father who was barely there with the weight of the Wilson name. Dylan and Dash were adopted sons, carried the family crest in silence, always half visible, their stories rarely told at all. 7 children, 7 fates. Some stepped into the spotlight, willingly or not. Some hid, changing their names, refusing interviews, moving far from California's Golden Coast. Others fell into the same cycles of addiction, heartbreak, and reinvention that haunted their father. And yet behind every smile, every avoidance of the cameras was the same unanswered question. What does it mean to be Brian Wilson's child? To grow up in the shadow of a man celebrated as a genius, but remembered by his own family as broken. The world adored the songs, God Only Knows, Wouldn't It Be Nice, Good Vibrations. But behind every harmony was a discordant truth that shaped his children's lives. They were heirs not just to a fortune or a name, but to a complicated, unfinished story. What really happened to them?
In the beginning, there was only music. Brian Wilson grew up in Hawthorne, California, and with his brothers Carl and Dennis, he built a sound that captured the American dream of the 1960s. Endless summers, first loves, fast cars, and perfect waves. But behind the shimmering harmonies was a darker undercurrent. By the time the Beach Boys were household names, Brian was already spiraling under the pressure of expectation and the abuse of his domineering father. Drugs, paranoia, and depression would soon pull him into a decades-long battle with himself. For his children, this meant their father's legacy wasn't just a story told in record stores and radio broadcasts. It was lived every single day. When Brian quit touring in the 1960s, retreating from the world, the press called it eccentric. At home, it meant long stretches of silence, rooms filled with cigarette smoke, and a man who drifted through the house more like a visitor than a parent. Everything changed when Pet Sounds dropped in 1966, cementing Brian's reputation as a visionary. Fans and critics praised him, but the pressure nearly destroyed him. The years that followed were marked by aborted projects, erratic behavior, and stints in bed that stretched for months. Imagine being a child born into that chaos, Your father praised as a genius, but so fragile he could barely make it to the breakfast table. By the 1970s, Brian's inner collapse became impossible to hide. Public appearances showed a man bloated, withdrawn, sometimes incoherent. Reporters stalked the family, desperate for any glimpse of the fallen genius. The children grew up with their father's breakdowns splashed across headlines, their lives reduced to footnotes in a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. The 1980s brought lawsuits, feuds, and a controversial therapist who controlled nearly every aspect of Brian's life. Fans called it exploitation. For the children, it meant distance. Visits with their father were filtered through managers, doctors, and sometimes lawyers. Birthdays could pass without a call. Family gatherings felt more like negotiations than reunions. When Brian remarried in the 1990s and adopted 5 children with his second wife, the family fractured further. Carnie and Wendy, his older daughters, struggled with feelings of abandonment, even as they forged their own careers in music. The younger children, Dakota, Daria, Delanie, Dylan, and Dash, entered a world where their father's legacy was already carved in stone, but his presence was more symbolic than consistent. This was the shadow they all lived under. A man celebrated as the voice of an era, but remembered at home as a figure lost in fog. Courtrooms, recording studios, and rehab centers replaced playgrounds and bedtime rituals. Every child bore the Wilson name, but few carried their father's presence in the ways that mattered most. Still, the world only wanted to see Brian Wilson, genius. The media didn't ask what it meant for his children. To be born into the ire of a storm that never passed. The songs played on, the concerts filled arenas, and the Beach Boys brand endured. But behind the harmonies were children trying to find their own voices, their own identities, away from the roar of nostalgia. Behind the legacy were the untold lives of his children.
Number 7. Dakota Rose Wilson, born in 1997 in Los Angeles, under the unusual circumstance of being the daughter of a man who was already a legend and nearly 6 decades old. By the time Dakota came into the world, Brian Wilson had lived multiple lives. He was no longer the boy genius on stage, nor the ghostly recluse haunting his bedroom for months on end. He was a survivor, married to his second wife Melinda, medicated, stabilized, and carefully protected from the chaos that had consumed so much of his past. Dakota's birth wasn't accompanied by screaming fans or relentless paparazzi. It was quieter, more insulated, but that silence was deceptive. Her childhood was a paradox, sheltered yet haunted. The Wilson household in the late 1990s and early 2000s was filled with younger siblings, all adopted together, creating the illusion of a big, happy family. Melinda worked hard to provide the structure and normalcy Brian himself had never known. Dakota grew up in houses with gates, in neighborhoods where everyone knew her last name before they knew her face. At school, classmates sometimes whispered, "Isn't your dad that Beach Boys guy?" as if being his daughter was a celebrity status all on its own. For Dakota, it was both a point of pride and a shadow she could never outrun. Imagine being a teenager whose father's voice was already immortalized on every oldie station, whose smile appeared in documentaries, and whose nervous breakdowns were dissected in biographies. Imagine knowing strangers felt entitled to mourn or celebrate your father without ever having met him, while you navigated the simpler but more painful question: what was he really like at home? By most accounts, Dakota's father was kind but distant, gentle but often elsewhere, in mind if not in body. His mental illness never completely loosened its grip. There were days he was affectionate, even playful. But there were also long stretches when Brian receded, leaving Melinda to run the household. For Dakota, this meant learning early that her father was 2 things at once: the smiling icon on stage and the fragile man who could vanish into silence. Her turning point came, quietly, in the public eye. Unlike her older half-sisters Carnie and Wendy, Dakota never pursued the spotlight. She never formed a band, never tried to cash in on the family name. Instead, she stayed low profile, a choice that seemed less like rebellion, more like survival. The Wilson name carried both power and burden. For Dakota, the burden outweighed the temptation. As an adult, Dakota has remained largely invisible to the media. No music career, no reality shows, no memoirs spilling family secrets. She has built her life on privacy, something her father never had. While her older sisters' lives became tabloid fodder, Dakota has managed to hold on to anonymity. Friends describe her as protective of her siblings, particularly Daria, with whom she shares a close bond. For the Wilson children, adopted late in Brian's life, their solidarity has often been their strongest shield. Today, Dakota lives away from the cameras, her last name both a blessing and a cage. The world may never know the details of her path, her relationships, her career, her private struggles, and perhaps that's exactly how she wants it. If Brian Wilson's life was defined by exposure, recording studios, courtrooms, hospital wards, then Dakota's has been defined by the opposite, a choice to remain unseen. For her, survival meant silence. She was born into a family that sang of California sunshine, but grew up knowing shadows could last far longer than any summer.
Number 6. Daria Rose Wilson. Born in 1996, 1 year before her sister Dakota, in Los Angeles, under the shelter of Brian Wilson's second marriage. Like Dakota, Daria was adopted by Brian and Melinda in the late 1990s, a time when their home was filled with the noise of children rather than the echo of recording sessions. To outsiders, it seemed like Brian was finally trying to rewrite his family story. For Daria, it meant growing up in a household where love and structure were carefully manufactured, as if to undo the decades of chaos that had consumed Brian's earlier family life. Her childhood was almost normal on the surface. Melinda acted as a steady force, keeping the home predictable and safe, while Brian floated in and out, sometimes the affectionate father at the dinner table, other times the distracted genius lost in a fog of his own mind. To Daria, he was never just dad. He was the man strangers pointed to on TV, the one whose face flashed across magazine covers when new Beach Boys compilations were released. She learned early that her father wasn't just hers, he belonged to the world. School made the difference even sharper. Teachers, neighbors, even parents of classmates often mentioned the Beach Boys with glowing nostalgia. "Your father's music changed my life," they'd tell her, as if Daria herself had been part of the band. But at home, the reality was different. Brian's fragility loomed over everything. When he was well, he could be gentle, even joyful. When he wasn't, there was a silence so heavy it filled the whole house. For a child, the uncertainty was confusing, never knowing which version of her father would emerge on any given day. Her turning point came during adolescence, when she realized how much the Wilson name could take from her privacy. Unlike Carnie and Wendy, who had careers in the spotlight, Daria recoiled from fame. She saw what it had done to her sisters, the scrutiny, the weight of expectation, the way the media treated them as extensions of their father's story rather than people in their own right. Daria wanted no part of it. She chose the shadows, deliberately keeping her distance from music and from the machinery of fame. But the silence wasn't without cost. Some who knew the Wilson family say Daria wrestled with identity, what it meant to be a Wilson while deliberately avoiding the stage. Others point to her deep closeness with her siblings, especially Dakota, as proof that she found her family not in the limelight, but in private bonds. Together, the younger Wilson children created a cocoon, a quiet world within the glare of their father's celebrity. In adulthood, Daria's path diverged sharply from the spotlight. There were no concerts, no interviews, no memoirs, just a life lived far from the cameras. In the rare glimpses the public has caught of her, she appears reserved, careful, protective of her privacy. To some, that silence feels like a rebellion against a legacy she never asked for. Today, she remains largely invisible, just like Dakota, but her absence from the public stage speaks volumes. If Carnie and Wendy carried the Wilson name into the spotlight, Daria chose to bury it, at least in public view. For her, anonymity isn't a failure, it's freedom. Daria Rose Wilson's story is not one of scandal or tabloid tragedy. It's quieter, more haunting. A young woman choosing distance in order to survive a name that could easily consume her. She was born into a family that gave the world harmony, but she learned early that her own peace would only be found in silence.
Number 5. Dylan Wilson, born in 1999 in Los Angeles, adopted by Brian and Melinda Wilson during the later chapter of Brian's life. By the time Dylan entered the family, the chaos of the 1970s and 1980s was over. Brian was no longer the untouchable boy genius, nor the broken recluse hidden in bed for months. He was an older man, in recovery, carefully managed, sheltered from the public eye, and cushioned by the stability Melinda had worked so hard to create. Dylan didn't inherit the glare of the spotlight the way Carnie and Wendy once did. Instead, he was raised in an insulated household, safe, but still bound to a legacy impossible to escape. From the beginning, Dylan's life was shaped by contradiction. On the surface, his childhood was ordinary: suburban homes, family pets, siblings playing in the yard. But the backdrop was extraordinary: gold records on the walls, fans occasionally camped outside, and whispers everywhere about his father's brilliance and madness. For Dylan, Brian wasn't just dad. He was a man people spoke about in hushed tones, as if living in the same house as him meant living with living history. Growing up as one of 5 adopted children gave Dylan the rare advantage of being surrounded by siblings who shared the same strange reality. Dakota, Daria, Delanie, and Dash all knew what it meant to live with a famous father who was both present and distant. Together they formed a small, protective unit, one that helped them carve out a sense of normalcy. But even in that cocoon, Dylan couldn't escape the awareness that his father's fame overshadowed every part of their existence. The turning point for Dylan came in adolescence, when the Wilson name began to feel less like an honor and more like a target. Unlike his older sisters, Dylan never tried to enter the music industry, never attempted to transform the Wilson legacy into his own career. He stayed private, avoiding the stage, the cameras, and the endless comparisons that would inevitably come. For Dylan, the price of peace was anonymity. As he grew older, Dylan's relationship with his father remained complicated. Brian was affectionate in bursts, sometimes playful, but often distracted or absent. Melinda became the steady parent, the one ensuring Dylan and his siblings had something resembling a stable home life. Brian was more like a figure who drifted in and out, loved deeply but inconsistently. For Dylan, this meant learning how to balance love with disappointment, affection with absence. Adulthood took him further into privacy. Unlike Carnie and Wendy, who built careers in music and opened their lives to public consumption, Dylan receded almost completely. There are no interviews, no performances, no tabloid stories. His life today is quiet, by design. Some say he pursued education away from Los Angeles. Others suggest he chose to remain within a close circle of family and friends, uninterested in fame's seduction. What is certain is that Dylan has refused to let the Wilson name dictate his destiny. Still, even in silence, the weight of his father's shadow lingers. Imagine being young, carrying the name of a man hailed as one of the greatest songwriters of all time, while also knowing that same man struggled to function as a father. Imagine growing up with the echoes of God Only Knows and Good Vibrations in every corner of American culture, and realizing those songs weren't just classics, they were fragments of the person who raised you. Today, Dylan Wilson remains largely unseen, a son of Brian Wilson who chose a different kind of inheritance. Not the music, not the fame, but the simple pursuit of a life that belongs to him alone. For Dylan, survival wasn't about carrying on the legacy. It was about refusing to let the legacy define him.
Number 4. Dash Tristan Wilson, born in 2009, adopted into the Wilson household when Brian was already well into his 60s. His arrival marked the final chapter of Brian and Melinda's large blended family, the youngest child in a home already filled with siblings and the heavy history of a father who was both a legend and a fragile human being. Dash entered a world that was at once quieter than the chaos of Brian's Burley life, yet still shaped by the enormous weight of his father's name. From the start, Dash's origin was different. He never knew the version of Brian Wilson who hid away for months at a time, nor the volatile public figure battling addiction and exploitation. What he inherited instead was a father stabilized by treatment, protected by Melinda, and softened by age. For Dash, Dad was not the mythic genius that fans worshipped, but the older man who might hum a tune at the breakfast table or drift into a memory about the old days without finishing the story. His world was shaped less by the spotlight and more by the protective cocoon Melinda wove around the younger Wilson children. Childhood for Dash was defined by 2 contrasts: privilege and privacy. The Wilson home provided everything: comfort, security, the stability that Brian's older daughters never had. But beneath the safety was an invisible tension, the knowledge that their father's name was more famous than their own faces would ever be. At school, the whispers were always there. That's Brian Wilson's kid. To classmates, it was a curiosity. To Dash, it was a burden he never chose. As the youngest, Dash was also the most insulated. His siblings, Dakota, Daria, Dylan, and Delanie, formed a protective wall around him, absorbing much of the outside world's curiosity. Still, he wasn't immune to the strangeness of growing up as Brian Wilson's son. Public outings could bring unwanted attention, strangers asking about songs written decades before he was born. Home life could feel overshadowed by Brian's legacy, even in its silence. His turning point was less dramatic than his siblings. Instead of rebellion or confrontation with fame, Dash's adolescence was marked by withdrawal. He did not follow the musical path, did not seek out interviews, did not lean into the Wilson family brand. If anything, he leaned away. Unlike Carnie and Wendy, who carried the family name into pop stardom with Wilson Phillips, Dash quietly slipped into obscurity, his story absent from headlines, his name rarely mentioned outside of family circles. Now in his mid-teens, Dash remains almost entirely invisible to the public. No performances, no paparazzi trails, no revelations. He has chosen silence, or perhaps had it chosen for him, as the family worked hard to protect the younger children from the cycles of fame and scrutiny that had devoured the older ones. To many, it feels as though Dash has grown up in the safest version of Brian Wilson's world, a world where the past is acknowledged but not allowed to dominate every corner of life. Yet, even in the quiet, the shadow of Brian's legacy lingers. It always will. Imagine being the youngest child of a man who shaped modern music and realizing that strangers know more about his past than you do. Imagine trying to grow into adulthood while carrying a name that the world will never forget, even if you long to be forgotten. Today, Dash Tristan Wilson lives far from the spotlight. There are no public clues about his career, his dreams, or his struggles. What we do know is this: in a family defined by fame and haunted by absence, his story is one of deliberate invisibility. For Dash, survival has meant growing up in the quietest corner of a loud legacy. His life remains unwritten in the public eye, and perhaps that is the only way to escape the music that has defined everyone else. He was born into the echo of a genius, but he chose not to make a sound.
Number 3. Delanie Ray Wilson, born in 1998 in Los Angeles, the third of Brian and Melinda's adopted children. She came into the family at a time when the Wilson household was already growing, her older sisters, Dakota and Daria, arriving just before her, and Dylan soon after. For Delanie, childhood was shaped by being caught in the middle, neither the oldest nor the youngest, neither the most visible nor the most hidden. Hers was a life of learning how to navigate a family defined by its famous patriarch, while quietly trying to carve out an identity of her own. Her birth and adoption came during the period when Brian was easing into late-life fatherhood. Unlike Carnie and Wendy, who remembered a father unraveling under the weight of his own mind, Delanie's earliest memories were of a calmer, more subdued version of Brian. He was medicated, guarded, less volatile. Still, the shadow of his history loomed. Gold records decorated the walls. Fans wrote letters addressed not just to Brian, but to the Wilson family. Home life was comfortable and stable under Melinda's steady hand, but it was never normal. Delanie's childhood was marked by a strange duality, one world inside the home, another outside of it. Within the walls of the Wilson house, she was simply a daughter and a sister, surrounded by siblings who shared the same unusual reality. Outside, she carried a last name that immediately sparked recognition. Teachers and neighbors would tell her how her father's music changed their youth, but those words only widened the distance between the myth of Brian Wilson and the man she knew at home. The turning point for Delanie came as she grew into adolescence. Her older sisters, Carnie and Wendy, had by then lived entire lives in the public eye. Chart-topping records, tabloid stories, even reality television appearances. Their fame made the Wilson name burn even brighter. For Delanie, it meant pressure. There were whispers about whether she too might follow in her father's footsteps, whether the younger Wilson children might form a group of their own. But Delanie resisted. Music wasn't her path, at least not in any public sense. To her, stepping onto that stage meant surrendering her individuality to the same machine that had consumed so much of her father's life. Instead, Delanie retreated into privacy.
while Carnie and Wendy struggled openly with body image, addiction, and the crushing glare of media attention, Delanie deliberately stayed in the background. She avoided interviews, avoided public appearances, and chose anonymity where possible. For some, this choice was seen as a rejection of the Wilson legacy. For Delanie, it was survival. Adulthood has only reinforced that decision. In recent years, Delanie has kept her life almost completely invisible to the public eye. Unlike her older sisters, she hasn't capitalized on the family name. She hasn't attempted to write a memoir, record music, or step onto a stage. Friends describe her as private, independent, and determined to build a life separate from her father's fame. Still, even silence carries a cost. Being a Wilson meant constantly walking in a shadow, no matter how far she tried to step away. Imagine being a young adult, trying to forge your own path, only to have every introduction begin with, "Are you related to Brian Wilson?" For Delanie, anonymity may have been her greatest act of rebellion, but it also meant invisibility, her story becoming a blank space in the public narrative. Today, little is known about where she lives or what she pursues. That is by design. Her absence from the spotlight speaks as loudly as any hit song her father ever wrote. For Delanie Ray Wilson, the legacy of Brian Wilson was not a calling, but a weight. And by refusing to carry it, she may have found the only form of freedom available to her. She was the middle child in a family built on harmony, yet her own life became a quiet note that faded before the world ever heard it.
Number 2. Carnie Wilson, born April 29, 1968, in Bel Air, California. The first biological daughter of Brian Wilson and his first wife, Marilyn Rovell. Her birth came at the height of Brian's genius, just 2 years after California Girls, 2 years before Pet Sounds. To the world, Brian was the golden boy of American music. To Carnie, even as an infant, he was already an absence. The man celebrated on magazine covers was also the man slipping away from his own family, drowning in paranoia and pills. Carnie's childhood was not the dreamy California fantasy her father sold to the world. The Wilson home was filled with music, yes, but also with tension. Brian's breakdowns grew more frequent. Some days, he stayed in bed, unreachable. Other days, he wandered the house like a ghost, muttering about songs that never got finished. Marilyn, overwhelmed and often alone, did her best to protect Carnie and later Wendy, but the weight was crushing. Imagine being a little girl watching your father praised as a genius by strangers, while knowing at home he was a man unraveling before your eyes. Her turning point came in the 1980s, when Carnie and Wendy decided to reclaim the Wilson name in their own way. Along with their childhood friend, China Phillips, they formed Wilson Phillips. The trio's debut album in 1990 was an explosion. Hold On became an anthem, their harmonies a direct echo of Brian's own artistry. For a brief, shining moment, Carnie was no longer just Brian Wilson's daughter. She was a star in her own right. The success was intoxicating, but the shadow never disappeared. Every interview circled back to her father. Every review compared their voices to the Beach Boys. Even in triumph, the legacy loomed. Then came the tabloids. Carnie's weight became a cruel obsession for the media. Headlines mocked her appearance. Talk shows made her the butt of jokes, and the pressure only deepened her struggles with food and self-image. She turned to food for comfort, then to gastric bypass surgery, then to more surgeries after regaining weight. The cycle played out in public, each battle with her body becoming front-page fodder. For Carnie, it was a lifelong war, not just with her health, but with a culture that seemed determined to humiliate her. Adulthood brought both resilience and heartbreak. Carnie hosted talk shows, appeared on reality TV, and became a spokesperson for body positivity long before it was mainstream. She married musician Rob Von Filio in 2000 and built a family of her own, determined to give her children the stability she never had. But even as she found personal joy, the Wilson legacy remained heavy. Her father's mental illness, his absence, his late life remarriage, all of it fractured the family she longed for. Today, Carnie is still active in music, performing with Wilson Phillips and occasionally appearing in television projects. She has been candid about her struggles, refusing to let shame silence her. She is in many ways the most visible of Brian's children, her life a constant balancing act between survival and spectacle.
Yet beneath the resilience is something quieter, more haunting. Carnie grew up wanting a father she never truly had. She built a career from his harmonies, but she also carried his wounds. The world remembers her as the voice behind Hold On, but her story is inseparable from the silence of the man who raised her. Carnie Wilson's life is proof of how fame can both create and consume. How love for a father can coexist with resentment for the shadow he cast. She once sang of hope and endurance, but behind the music is the voice of a daughter who never stopped waiting for harmony at home.
Number 1. Wendy Glenn Wilson, born October 16, 1969 in Bel Air, California, just 18 months after her sister Carnie. If Carnie arrived at the peak of Brian's ascent, Wendy was born as he began to crumble. By the end of that year, Brian had retreated further from touring, his paranoia and drug use escalating. To the outside world, he was a visionary pushing pop music into new frontiers. To Wendy, he was a father already slipping behind a veil of illness. Wendy's earliest years were marked by instability. The Wilson household was a strange mix of Hollywood glamour and private despair. Friends, bandmates, and hangers-on drifted in and out. At times, the home felt like a party, other times like a morgue. Brian's absences, whether lost in bed for days or simply lost in his own head, were constant. For Wendy, childhood became an exercise in adaptation, learning to find steadiness in a world where the ground never stopped shifting. Like her sister, Wendy was swept into the family legacy early. As teenagers, she and Carnie were already harmonizing, their voices blending in a way that seemed predestined. When they joined forces with China Phillips in 1989, it wasn't just a band, it was an exorcism, a way of reclaiming the Wilson name. Wilson Phillips' debut album in 1990 shattered expectations, selling millions of copies worldwide. Wendy, often described as the quieter of the Wilson sisters, suddenly found herself in the center of pop stardom. The world praised their harmonies as spiritual successors to the Beach Boys, but for Wendy, success was bittersweet. Every interview circled back to her father. Every note seemed compared to his. The turning point came in the mid-1990s after Wilson Phillips disbanded. Unlike Carnie, who dove headfirst into television and public appearances, Wendy stepped back. She married record producer Daniel Knutson in 2002 and focused on raising their 4 sons. Domestic life, quiet and steady, became her rebellion against the chaos of her upbringing. For Wendy, family meant control, a way of rewriting the childhood she'd been denied. Still, the shadow lingered. Wendy never fully escaped the weight of Brian's name. Even in her own career, she was asked to speak for him, to explain him, to embody the harmonies he made famous. And as Brian remarried and adopted 5 children with Melinda, the family dynamic grew even more complicated. Wendy and Carnie often spoke publicly about feeling distanced, even replaced. The wounds of abandonment, seeded in childhood, never fully healed. In adulthood, Wendy's life has been marked by resilience and quiet dignity. She has continued to reunite with Wilson Phillips for tours and special performances, but her focus has remained on her family. Friends describe her as private, devoted, and protective of her children. Unlike Carnie, who has lived much of her struggle in the public eye, Wendy has chosen silence as her shield. Yet, the haunting truth is that Wendy, perhaps more than any of Brian's children, carried the heaviest weight. She was old enough to remember the unraveling, young enough to be shaped by it permanently. Imagine being a child, watching your father slip away while the world sang his praises. Imagine building your adult life around stability, not because it was natural to you, but because instability had been your inheritance. Today, Wendy Wilson lives in Los Angeles with her husband and children, her life far quieter than the roar of the Beach Boys legend. She rarely grants interviews, rarely courts attention. For her, survival has meant retreat, not from love, but from the glare that once consumed her family. Wendy Glenn Wilson was born into a family that defined harmony, yet her own life became a long search for balance. She may never escape the shadow of Brian's genius, but she has built something he never could, a home untouched by chaos. She was the daughter who lived through the unraveling, and her silence says more than any song ever could.
7 children, 7 lives marked not just by the legacy of a father, but by the silence of his absence. Brian Wilson gave the world symphonies disguised as pop songs, music so beautiful it felt eternal. But for his children, the legacy wasn't melody, it was shadow. Carnie and Wendy were the first to carry the burden, their childhoods shaped by a man vanishing even as the world worshipped him. They turned pain into music, built careers from harmonies that echoed their father's genius, and spent decades negotiating with the same public that had both crowned and crucified him. For them, fame was both inheritance and curse. The younger children, Delanie, Dakota, Daria, Dylan, and Dash, entered a different chapter. Their father was older, softer, but still marked by scars that never healed. They were raised in a home carefully shielded by Melinda, who tried to give them the normalcy Brian never had. Yet even in safety, the shadow remained. Every introduction carried the name Wilson. Every whisper carried the expectation of brilliance or the curiosity of gossip. To survive, they turned inward, choosing silence over spectacle. The contrast is striking. Two daughters forced into the spotlight, their private struggles broadcast to the world. 5 younger children who vanished almost entirely, constructing their lives away from cameras, interviews, and expectations. But beneath the differences lies the same truth. All 7 were shaped by the same legacy. A father loved by millions, but elusive at home. A man celebrated for harmony, yet unable to hold his family together. This is the cost of genius. It creates beauty for the world, but often leaves wreckage behind closed doors. For the Wilson children, survival meant either carrying the name loudly or burying it quietly. Behind every legendary name are lives the world was never meant to see. And so we're left with the question, if you carried that last name, if you were born a Wilson, would you keep it as a badge of honor or would you bury it forever?